Well, not surprisingly, Labor and the Coalition have colluded to push through a bill that they hope will secure their futures, while limiting the competition they face from minor parties and independents come election time. Don Farrell, the man who, when addressing the criticism that Labor's election donation laws would just entrench the two-party system and lock out challengers, is quoted as saying, "That's the point," got his wish and got this bill rammed through with little to no scrutiny, thanks to a deal with the Coalition. And let's be honest, when the two major parties strike backroom deals to ram things through with little or no scrutiny, it's rarely a good outcome for Australia. That's not to say that there aren't some positive steps forward within the bill, because there are. The donation disclosure threshold has been lowered, that's a good thing. It's down to $5,000, although it needs to be said that prior to the last minute wheeling and dealing between Labor and the Coalition, this threshold was going to be set at $1,000, which would have been far better. But anyway, there's also real-time or close to real-time disclosures, and they're a good thing too. But when you hear independents like David Pocock describe the bill as a stitch-up, just know that he's right. It is a stitch-up driven by self-interest and self-preservation. And we need to be honest, these reforms don't do what's advertised on the tin. They don't take big money out of politics. It's still going to be there, and there are plenty of loopholes in there that can be exploited by the major parties. You might be asking, what loopholes? Well, the $5,000 disclosure threshold applies per recipient. Political parties like Labor and the Liberals have branches in each state and territory, so say you wanted to donate around $45,000 to the Labor Party without disclosing it, you can donate $4,999.99 to the 9 state and federal Labor branches, effectively donating $45,000 without the need for disclosure. Then there's the annual gift cap that was originally supposed to be $20,000 but was upped to $50,000 after Labor and the Coalition put their heads together. This annual gift cap, well, it's got the same loophole as the disclosure threshold. So again, if you felt so inclined, you could bypass the $50,000 cap and funnel $450,000 to the Labor Party instead, provided you did so by gifting $50,000 to each of the 9 state and federal Labor branches. I guess in theory, someone could also donate to a party's nominated entities as well, but more on that later. The overall gift cap is $1.6 million, so still pretty big money in my book. Oh, and these caps, they're all reset should a general election be called. Yes, there'll be caps on campaign spending, which might sound okay in passing, but they start to stink when you stop to think about them. The $800,000 limit per electorate for each candidate sounds reasonable, but parties then have a $90 million national campaign cap. That's $90 million they can spend nationally at their own discretion. So what will happen here is that should an independent mount a decent campaign and look like they are posing a threat to a sitting Labor or Coalition member, the major party candidate will be able to spend their $800,000, and then their party can come in and throw extra money from their $90 million slush fund toward a party-based campaign, so long as the local member is not specifically named. David Pocock probably explains this a little bit better.
So it could be $800,000 backing the Liberal Labor candidate by name, and then it's $2 million backing Liberals or Labor. Just don't mention their name. And that's not a level playing field.
The bill imposes a $20,000 cap in total for all donations by a single donor to a political party or its candidates in a state or territory. While on the high side, it doesn't seem excessive at first glance, but if you look closer, the numbers start to build. A rich donor can make a $20,000 donation to a party or one of its candidates in each of the 6 states, 2 territories, and to the federal branch of the party, and they can do that annually. Probably the worst part, given all the cost of living talk that you'll hear when you're listening to Question Time, this bill ensures that taxpayers will provide even more funding for campaigns and political parties. Currently, a candidate will receive $3.39 per vote. Dodgy Don's bill increases that up to $5 per vote. While it will apply to everyone, there's no doubt that the major parties are the biggest beneficiary here by a substantial margin. It's just a fact that major parties run candidates nationwide. Compare that to a minor party that might run in a quarter of the seats or less, or to an independent that obviously only runs in one. I mean, that's also great for incumbents as it'll give them a bit of a head start funding-wise, but it's not so great for newcomers. When you have a look at how many votes were received by the major parties last election, you can see how this will quickly generate a nice little return, right? Don's reforms also do nothing to address nominated entities, which are rabbit holes all of their own, but will likely end up serving as investment vehicles for the major parties, as has happened in Victoria, where the majors have already stitched up their own reforms at a state level. Victoria's expert panel review have argued for the removal of these nominated entity loopholes, but they look like they've made their way into the federal model regardless. As the Victorian review found, a key feature of nominated entities is that the transfer of funds from the nominated entity to its party or from the party to its nominated entity is not considered a gift or political donation. In the case of Victoria, only Labor and the Coalition have registered nominated entities, so that should give you some indication of who stands to benefit most from this loophole. Watching Don Farrell's interview on Sky News was like watching him try to put lipstick on a pig. So let's take a look.
For 3 years now, we've been going through the process of looking at how do we make the Australian electoral system more transparent and more available to ordinary Australians. It shouldn't be the case that you have to have the backing of a millionaire or a billionaire to get elected to the Australian Parliament. Ordinary Australians have got to have an ability to get elected.
I mean, Don's right. It shouldn't be the case, but sadly it is. And sadly, nothing he's put forward changes that fact. Don wouldn't be sitting there without the millions of dollars that have been pumped into the Labor Party machine over the years.
Have got to have an ability to get elected. And this electoral reform does exactly that.
No, it doesn't.
OK, Zali says the rivers of gold that flow into her campaign should be unrestricted. I don't think that's what the Australian people want out of their electoral system.
No, I don't think she's saying that at all. You can read the amendments she tabled if you want to know what she is saying, but to summarise, what she's been saying is the bill deserves more scrutiny than has been allowed, and I'd have to say that the number of amendments rammed through in the final hours suggests that she raises a valid concern. The bill creates an unfair playing field, giving advantages to incumbents over new candidates, provides disproportionate yearly administrative assistance funding to major political parties. It does. It entrenches political party advantage over independent candidates by imposing a spending cap on individual seats while still permitting additional party advertising under a party's $90 million national cap, which it does. They're all valid points. And finally, she notes the obvious, that in the midst of cost of living pressures, the government is giving itself and other parties substantial increases of public funding instead of prioritising increased support to Australians. Again, she's right. But Don's statement is pretty consistent with what you can expect to see from the major parties and their backers. They just love to misrepresent the current independent movement, and heading into the next election you'll see all sorts of false claims. You'll probably hear that they're all bankrolled by Simon Holmes à Court. They're not. This one must come up so often it gets its own FAQ on the Climate 200 website. And it needs to be said, as far as disclosure goes, Climate 200 goes above and beyond what you see from the majors. The Teal independents always vote the same as Labor and or the Greens. They don't. It takes about 20 seconds to debunk that one. The Teals always vote with one another. Again, they don't. And again, it takes about 20 seconds to debunk. But Sky News love this one anyway.
Research shows, parliamentary research, that the group of 7 Teals mostly voted together as a pack, and they voted the same way 83% of the time.
What?
I mean, common sense would tell you that a bunch of independents who had campaigned on very similar platforms would carry very similar values, and therefore they'd generally vote down very similar lines a lot of the time. There's no real story there. A lot of the times they vote the same way, but let's be honest, we're not talking Labor or coalition levels of conformity here. I guess that's the thing about being independent. You're free to vote on your own conscience. Which is not something you can say of members of the major parties. Maybe a look at the independent movement deserves its own video, but anyway, let's get back to Don.
They want greater transparency, and this delivers that, Kieran. For the first time at the election after next, when you walk into the ballot box, you will know exactly how much money has been paid to the candidate you're contemplating voting for, and who's providing that money.
No, you won't, Don. Parties will still be able to pocket hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of dark money without disclosure, thanks to the many and varied loopholes.
Major parties can receive unlimited transfers from what they are calling nominated entities. And last election cycle, the Coalition accepted nearly 10 million from something called the Cormac Foundation. And the Labor Party accepted around 6 million from Labor Services and Holdings.
Donors will have to disclose at a much lower level, so anything above $5,000.
Again, Don, not strictly true of the major parties, is it? I mean, loopholes.
The important thing is that we are capping the amount of money that you can spend on a lower house seat.
That's $800,000.
$800,000.
What do you say to the crossbench who argue, in a nutshell, they say they get capped at $800,000, but then a Labor candidate can spend $800,000, and then the Labor Party machine can go into that seat and spend another $2 million on Labor ads?
Look,
because there's no cap on that.
Well, there is a cap on that.
On the party spend.
On the party spend, there's a cap, a total cap, and of course
in the seats though.
Across the board, you can't spend, a party can't spend more than $90 million in elected.
But you could swamp. Their argument is you could swamp an independent in their seat.
Yes, I suppose they could.
Look.
They're worrying you're cutting them off at the knees, basically.
Look. Can I say a couple of things? If an independent can't get their message out with an $800,000 spend, then maybe they shouldn't be in the game.
I think it's always cute when Labor and the Coalition can align their talking points, although it does make it a little bit harder for them to dodge the duopoly tag.
If an independent can't get their message out with an $800,000 spend, then maybe they shouldn't be in the game.
As a former campaign director, I can say to the Teals, if they can't get their message out in a seat with $800,000, then they need to look at their message.
This puts downward pressure on both the independents' ability to spend money, but also their opponents' ability to spend money.
But there's far more downward pressure on independents than major parties though, isn't there? When you look at the totality of this bill, it's fairly obvious that this is not about levelling the playing field. It's about defending the major parties from the threat of minor parties and independents, because I guess that it's far easier for them to rig the system than it is to do something about the stuff that has led to their drop in popularity.
I say to the government and the opposition, do better to get people to vote for you. That's why people aren't voting for you. Don't change the rules to suit themselves.
Remember, these changes won't come into effect until the 2028 election, so there's time for them to be amended. And amendments could be on the table if either major is looking for the support of minor parties and independents to form government in a couple of months' time. In Victoria, similar reforms are now being challenged in the High Court, so it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. But for now, there's really no defending the ramming through of this bill. Of all the things Parliament could have been working on and pushing through in what may well be the last sitting week of the current government's term, the fact that they chose self-interest and self-preservation really does tell you everything you need to know about what is driving the major parties at the moment.